May 7th,
Thank you, Sergeant.
1945. The
All right,
war in
next in
Europe was
line.
hours from
Yes.
ending. Across America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, preparations for celebration were already underway. Ticker tape was being gathered in New York. Church bells were being polished in small towns throughout the Midwest. Mothers and wives and sweethearts were planning parties for sons and husbands and lovers who would finally mercifully come home. But in a modest prisoner of war facility outside Colorado Springs, Colorado, something was happening that would challenge everything Americans thought they understood about victory, about redemption, about the simple transformative power of human kindness. Camp Commander Colonel William Patterson stood before 53 German women in the mess hall that morning. These were enemy prisoners captured during the final chaotic months of fighting in Europe. Radio operators, nurses, administrative clerks. Young women who had served the Wehrmacht, who had believed in their cause, who had worn the uniform of a regime that had brought unspeakable horror to the world. The colonel had gathered them to announce their impending repatriation. Transportation back to Germany would be arranged within 3 weeks. The war was over. They would go home. He expected relief, perhaps even joy. What happened instead would become one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of American military operations. 22 women stepped forward. Their faces showed months of internal struggle, of confusion, of a transformation so profound that it had shaken the very foundations of everything they had been taught to believe. They made an impossible request. They asked to stay in captivity rather than return to freedom in their homeland. Ottilie Bauer, known to everyone as Tilly, was among them. 21 years old, standing with her hands clasped in front of her, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was asking. Behind her stood Herta Schneider, a 31-year-old nurse from Nuremberg. Beside her, Eloise Becker, 26, a signals operator, whose hands still trembled when she thought about going back. 22 women, 22 enemy prisoners, begging to remain imprisoned in America rather than accept freedom in Germany. The colonel stared at them in disbelief. The American guards exchanged confused glances. Several of the German women who had chosen to return home looked at their former comrades with expressions that mixed pity and incomprehension. What could possibly transform enemy prisoners into people who preferred American captivity to German freedom? The answer lay not in grand political gestures or dramatic moments of conversion. It wasn't about ideology or patriotism or the complex geopolitics of a shattered continent. It was about something far simpler, something almost absurdly ordinary. It began with butter, real butter, creamy and golden, spread thick on mashed potatoes that steamed on metal trays in an American mess hall. Before we discover how something as mundane as butter could change the course of 53 lives, how a simple meal could shatter years of carefully constructed lies, how kindness could prove more powerful than any weapon, we need to go back. Back to a cold November afternoon 6 months earlier. Back to the moment when these women first arrived on American soil and confronted a reality that made no sense within the framework of everything they had been taught to believe. The story begins there, in that first impossible moment, when propaganda collided with truth and the collision was so violent, so complete, that it would alter the trajectory of lives forever. November 14th, 1944. The transport trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Carson just after 2 in the afternoon. The Colorado sky was that particular shade of blue you only find in the mountains, sharp and cold and impossibly vast. The wind came down from Pikes Peak with a bite that cut through the threadbare coats the women wore, wool that had been good quality once but was now worn thin by years of war and deprivation. Corporal Francine Sullivan stood near the entrance as the trucks came to a stop. She was 27, one of only 3 female guards assigned to the facility. The military had little experience with female prisoners of war. Everything about this situation was unprecedented, uncertain, delicate, in ways that made the command structure nervous. She watched as the women descended from the trucks, 53 of them, just ranging from 19 to 32. They moved with military discipline, backs straight, faces carefully blank. But their eyes told a different story. They darted nervously, taking in every detail of their surroundings, with the hypervigilance of people who expected the worst and were preparing for it. Most were thin, some alarmingly so. Their gray auxiliary uniforms hung loose on frames that had clearly known months of inadequate nutrition. Their skin had that particular pallor that comes from vitamin deficiencies. Their hair was dull brittle. These were young women who should have been in the prime of health and vigor. Instead, they looked worn, used up older than their years. Tilly stepped down from the second truck, clutching a small leather diary against her chest. It was one of the few personal possessions she had been allowed to keep. Inside were fragments of her life before the war, sketches of her sister, a pressed flower from her grandmother's garden, recipes her mother had written out in careful script, scattered thoughts about boys and music and dreams of becoming a teacher after Germany won the war. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943. She was 18 then, idealistic, convinced she was contributing to her country's defense. Her father had been killed on the Eastern Front 6 months before she enlisted. Her mother needed her to stay home, but Tilly felt she owed something to her father's memory. Service seemed honorable, necessary, right? Now standing in the Colorado wind with her thin coat pulled tight against the mountain chill, she wasn't certain of anything anymore. The processing took most of the afternoon. The women were photographed, documented, issued new clothing to supplement their worn uniforms. Throughout the procedure, they remained silent, except when directly questioned, responding in clipped German, that the camp's translator, a German-American sergeant named Wilhelm Klein, converted to English for the records. But Francine noticed something odd. The women kept glancing toward a building on the far side of the compound. Their expressions held something that looked almost like fear mixed with confusion. Some seemed to be sniffing the air, trying to identify something they couldn't quite place. It was Sergeant Theodore Jackson who finally explained what they were reacting to. The Mississippi-born cook had been preparing the evening meal all afternoon. The smells from the mess hall kitchen had been drifting across the compound since noon. The scent of cooking meat, of baking bread, of real food being prepared in quantities that seemed impossible to women who had lived through years of German wartime rationing. Tilly stood in line during processing, trying to identify the aromas that contradicted everything she knew about America. Everything she had been taught, everything she believed. She had been told that Americans were suffering from food shortages, that their soldiers went hungry while German forces had plenty, that the United States was a nation on the brink of collapse, its people starving, its infrastructure, failing its will to fight crumbling under the weight of resource scarcity and social decay. Yet the smells reaching her told a different story entirely, one that made no sense within the framework of everything she believed. Before arriving at Camp Carson, every woman in that compound had spent months or years absorbing a carefully constructed narrative about their American enemies. The propaganda had been thorough, consistent, repeated until it became indistinguishable from truth. In training facilities across Germany, female auxiliaries had been shown films depicting American poverty and deprivation. Newsreels of breadlines in major cities, photographs of empty store shelves, statistics about industrial collapse and agricultural failure. The presentations were professional, convincing, backed by what appeared to be authentic evidence. American soldiers, they were told, survived on minimal rations while fighting a war their citizens opposed. The American home front was supposedly characterized by food riots, desperate shortages of every basic necessity, social unrest on the verge of revolution. Meanwhile, Germany was portrayed as a nation of plenties, blessed with superior organization and resources that would ensure ultimate victory. Tilly remembered her training in Stuttgart with uncomfortable clarity. The instructors had been persuasive. They had shown film of American children with hollow eyes, of mothers fighting over bread, of cities in decay and despair. And Tilly had believed it. Why wouldn't she? Information in wartime Germany was tightly controlled. Alternative viewpoints simply didn't exist in any accessible form. When Wilhelmine Hoffman called Mina had joined the Auxiliary Corps, at 28, she had done so partly from patriotic duty, but also from practical necessity. The Corps offered regular meals at a time when civilian rations were becoming increasingly sparse. But she had been assured that the shortages were temporary, strategic necessities. Germany was simply redirecting its abundant resources toward final victory. Once the war was won, prosperity would return. What none of them had been told, what they couldn't have known, was that their own experience of growing hunger in Germany was far closer to the truth of the war than any of the propaganda they had consumed. By 1944, German civilian rations had been cut repeatedly. Butter had become a rare luxury. Fresh meat appeared sporadically, if at all. Bread was made from increasingly creative substitutes as grain supplies dwindled. The women had noticed these changes, of course. They weren't blind, but they had attributed them to temporary wartime necessities, not to fundamental resource shortages in their own country. Now standing in an American prison camp and smelling food cooking in quantities she hadn't encountered in years, Tilly felt the first crack appear into the foundation of everything she thought she knew. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. At 1800 hours, dinner was announced. The women filed into the mess hall with the rigid discipline that came from military training. But their eyes betrayed them. Wide, uncertain, fixed on the serving line with an intensity that spoke of desperate hunger barely held in check. The building was warm, actually warm, heated against the November cold in a way that German facilities had rarely managed in recent years. Long tables with attached benches filled the space. At the far end, a serving line had been set up where American kitchen staff waited with large serving implements. The smells were overwhelming, rich, complex, utterly impossible. Tilly moved through the line in a daze, holding her metal tray as instructed. Her hands shook slightly. She tried to control it, tried to maintain the dignity that had been drilled into her during training. Enemy or not, she was still a German auxiliary. She would not show weakness. She would not reveal desperation. Sergeant Jackson stood behind the serving counter. He was tall, with dark skin and gentle eyes that seemed to see more than most people did. He had been cooking in the military for 3 years, but these German women were unlike any group he had previously served. He could see it in the way they moved, the way they held themselves, the way their eyes tracked every motion of his serving spoon. He spooned a portion onto Tilly's tray without comment. Mashed potatoes, fluffy and white steam rising from them in the cool air. A mountain of them, more than Tilly had seen in a single serving in years. Then green beans, actually green. Not the gray-brown color of vegetables that had been boiled to death in institutional kitchens. These were bright, fresh-looking, cooked just enough to be tender. Then a piece of roasted chicken, actual meat with crispy golden skin. The kind of chicken Tilly remembered from childhood Sunday dinners before the war, before everything changed. The piece was generous, substantial, more protein than she had typically received in an entire day during her final months in Germany. And then Sergeant Jackson did something that Tilly would remember for the rest of her life. He added a pat of butter to the top of her mashed potatoes. Real butter, golden and solid, beginning to melt into the hot potatoes from the heat rising up. Not margarine, not some chemical substitute made from coal byproducts, not the ersatz spreads that had become standard in Germany. Real butter. Tilly stared at it. She couldn't help herself, couldn't maintain the facade of indifference. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she had seen real butter. The last time had been at her grandmother's house in Stuttgart in the autumn of 1942, before the shortages became severe, before everything good disappeared from German tables. She carried her tray to a table and sat with Herta and Gertrude Lang, called Trudy, a 23-year-old clerk from Munich, whose glasses sat crooked on her face, one arm repaired with wire. But Tilly couldn't take her eyes off the butter. It was melting now, creating golden rivulets that ran through the white potatoes like precious streams. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions. Some stared at their trays in silence, as if afraid that looking away would make the food disappear. Others whispered to each other in rapid German, their voices pitched high with confusion and disbelief. A few were already eating mechanically at first, then with increasing speed, as if afraid the food might be taken away before they could finish. Eloise Becker had tears streaming down her face as she ate. Whether from relief or shame or simple overwhelming emotion even, she couldn't have said. Tilly finally picked up her fork. The metal was cold in her hand. Solid, real. She scooped a small amount of mashed potatoes, making sure to get some of the melting butter. She lifted it to her mouth and paused for just a moment. Some part of her was reluctant to cross this threshold, to accept this gift, to acknowledge what it meant. Then she tasted it. The butter was rich and creamy the way butter was supposed to be. The potatoes were smoothed properly, seasoned with salt and pepper. Not too much, just enough. The flavor was so intense after years of bland, inadequate food that it almost hurt, like looking at bright light and after too long in darkness. She closed her eyes, felt something break inside her chest, some carefully maintained wall between what she believed and what was real, some barrier between the propaganda and the truth. This wasn't starvation. This wasn't deprivation. This wasn't a nation on the brink of collapse. This was abundance. Casual, everyday American abundance. The kind of meal that was probably considered ordinary, unremarkable standard. Nothing special, just dinner. And it was better than anything Tilly had eaten in 3 years. Around the mess hall, the realization was spreading through the group like ripples across water. You could see it in their faces, in the way their expressions shifted from hunger to satisfaction, to confusion, to something approaching horror as the implications became clear. They had been lied to, completely, systematically, about America, about the war, about the fundamental nature of reality. If America wasn't starving, what else wasn't true? If American prisoners ate better than German citizens, what did that say about the regime they had served if the enemy could be this generous, this kind, this decent to people who had fought against them, who was really the enemy? Tilly ate slowly, methodically, making each bite last. The chicken was tender, perfectly seasoned. The green beans had been cooked with what tasted like bacon, adding a smoky richness. The potatoes with their melting butter were like something from a dream, a memory of better times she had thought were lost forever. When she finished, she sat for a long moment with her empty tray in front of her. Then she did something she hadn't done since her capture. Something she had sworn she wouldn't do. Something that felt like a betrayal and a relief all at once. She got up and went back to the serving line for seconds. Sergeant Jackson spooned another portion onto her plate without comment. No judgment, no surprise, no mockery. Just quiet acceptance of the fact that she was still hungry and he had food to give. He added another pat of butter to the fresh mound of potatoes, gestured toward the bread at the end of the line, indicating she should take extra if she wanted. Tilly returned to her table, ate the second helping more slowly than the first, and as she ate, she began to understand something profound and terrible. The propaganda hadn't just been wrong, it had been the opposite of truth, a complete inversion of reality. America wasn't starving while Germany thrived. Germany was starving while America thrived. German citizens were hungry, while German prisoners in America ate better than they ever had at home. That night in the barracks, Tilly took out her leather diary, opened it to a fresh page, stared at the blank paper for a long time, trying to find words adequate to what she had experienced. Finally, she wrote, "Today I tasted real butter for the first time in 3 years. It was on mashed potatoes served by an American cook in a prison camp in Colorado. And as it melted in my mouth, I realized something terrifying. Everything we were told was a lie." She paused, then added, "If they lied about American starvation, what else did they lie about? Who were we really serving, and what have we done?" The questions hung in the air of the cold barracks like ghosts, unanswerable, demanding acknowledgement, refusing to be ignored. Now, if you or your father served in World War II, especially if you encountered German prisoners of war in America, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below. These stories matter. They connect us to a generation that understood something we're in danger of forgetting. In the next 40 minutes, you're going to discover how that single meal with butter and mashed potatoes became the catalyst for one of the most extraordinary transformations in military history. How American kindness proved more powerful than any weapon. How simple decency shattered years of propaganda. And how 22 women came to make a choice that shocked the world. This is a story about food, yes, but it's really about something deeper. About the power of truth, about what happens when reality contradicts everything you've been taught to believe. About the moment when carefully constructed lies collapse under the weight of simple, undeniable experience. This is the story of how butter changed history. But how did these 53 women end up in a prison camp in Colorado in the first place? How did young German auxiliaries scattered across Europe as their nation's military machine collapsed find themselves crossing an ocean to a continent most had only seen in propaganda films designed to make them fear and hate their enemies? The answer takes us back 3 months earlier to the chaos of the Western Front in the autumn of 1944. By September of that year, the Allied advance through France and Belgium had become unstoppable. What had begun on the beaches of Normandy in June was now rolling across the continent like an inexorable tide. German forces were in full retreat. Supply lines collapsed. Communication networks fragmented. Units that had been ordered to hold their positions found themselves surrounded, cut off, abandoned by a command structure that was itself disintegrating. The women who would eventually gather in Camp Carson had been scattered across dozens of different posts. Tilly had been stationed at a communications center outside Metz, monitoring radio frequencies and relaying messages between units that were increasingly desperate, increasingly fragmented. Herta had been working at a field hospital near the Belgian border, treating wounded soldiers with supplies that had dwindled to almost nothing. Their captures had come suddenly, not in dramatic firefights or heroic last stands, but in the confused scramble of a front that was simply evaporating. One moment they were at their posts, doing their jobs, maintaining the routines that military service demanded. The next American soldiers were at the door, weapons raised, orders being shouted in a language most of them barely understood. Surrender, hands up, no resistance. For Tilly, it happened on a Tuesday morning in mid-September. She and three other radio operators had been alone in their station. Their commanding officer had disappeared 2 days earlier, presumably fled. The Wehrmacht soldiers who were supposed to be guarding them had abandoned their posts the night before. When the American infantry arrived, the women were sitting at their desks, headphones on, still dutifully monitoring frequencies that had gone silent. The American sergeant who took them into custody looked almost embarrassed. These weren't hardened SS troops. These were young women in gray auxiliary uniforms, exhausted and scared, and obviously no threat to anyone. He was polite, professional. He ensured they were treated with the dignity the Geneva Convention required. That politeness, that professionalism was the first crack in Tilly's understanding of who Americans were. The initial processing happened in France. The women were gathered at collection points, documented, interviewed through translators. They were kept separate from male prisoners, housed in commandeered buildings that had once been schools or civic centers. The conditions were basic but adequate. They received regular meals, medical attention, blankets, treatment that was, if not comfortable, at least humane. But they were still in Europe, still relatively close to Germany, still within a context that made sense. The decision to transport female prisoners to America came from higher up the command chain. The European theater was chaotic. Resources were stretched. Space in existing POW camps was at a premium, reserved primarily for captured combatants. The relatively small number of female auxiliaries presented a logistical problem that someone somewhere decided would be better solved by shipping them across the Atlantic to facilities in the United States. The ocean crossing took 3 weeks. Tilly had never been on a ship before. None of them had. The vessel was a converted cargo transport, cramped and uncomfortable but seaworthy. They sailed in November when the North Atlantic was at its most brutal. The crossing was rough. Many of the women were seasick for days. They huddled below deck in holds that had been hastily converted into dormitories, listening to the howl of wind and the crash of waves against steel. During those 3 weeks, conversations happened that would prove crucial to what came later. Confined together with nothing to do but wait, the women talked. They shared their stories, their fears, their growing doubts about the war and the regime they had served. Herta, older and more experienced, became a de facto leader. She had seen things in the field hospitals that had shaken her faith long before her capture. She had watched young men die from infections that could have been easily treated if they had adequate antibiotics. She had amputated limbs with insufficient anesthesia. She had read letters from families back home describing hunger and bombing and desperation, while being told by command that Germany was winning, that victory was inevitable, that sacrifice was temporary. She spoke quietly to the other women during those long days at sea, asked questions they had been afraid to ask themselves. If Germany was winning, why were supplies so scarce? If America was starving, why did the American soldiers who captured them look so healthy, so well equipped? If the enemy was barbaric, why had their treatment been correct, even kind? The questions planted seeds, doubts that would blossom into full crisis of faith once they reached American soil. They made landfall at Newport News, Virginia in early November. The sight of the American coastline was overwhelming. Even from the ship you could see it. The scale, the abundance, the sheer industrial might of a nation that was not whatever German propaganda claimed, on the verge of collapse. The port was massive. Ships of every size lined the docks. Cranes lifted cargo that seemed endless. Trucks moved in constant streams. And everywhere American workers, well-fed, well-clothed, moving with the casual confidence of people who had never known real want. From Virginia, they traveled by train to Colorado. That journey, too, became a revelation. They passed through cities that were intact, undamaged, through countryside that was productive, prosperous, through towns where people went about their business without the fear that had become the constant backdrop of German life. Mina sat by the window for hours watching America pass by. She had expected ruins, poverty, the physical evidence of a nation at war losing its grip. What she saw instead was abundance so casual it seemed almost obscene. Farmland stretching to the horizon, cattle grazing in fields, stores that appeared to be open operating, serving customers. The train stopped in small towns along the way. Sometimes local people would gather to stare at the prisoners. There was curiosity in their faces. Sometimes hostility. But more often than not, what Tilly saw in those American faces was pity. Not fear, not hatred. Pity. That more than anything was disturbing. Because pity implied that they were the ones to be pitied. That they were the victims. That something terrible had been done to them. The women arrived at Camp Carson on that cold November afternoon we've already witnessed. But now you understand what they carried with them. 3 weeks at sea to process their doubts. Days on a train watching American prosperity roll past their windows. And underneath it all, years of propaganda that had told them the opposite of what their eyes were now showing them. When they filed into that mess hall for the first time, when they saw those trays loaded with real food, when Tilly tasted that butter melting into mashed potatoes, it wasn't just the flavor that overwhelmed her. It was the final, undeniable confirmation that everything had been a lie. The days following that first meal established a pattern that only deepened their confusion and shame. Breakfast brought eggs, real eggs with yellow yolks, not the powdered substitutes that had become standard in Germany. The eggs came with bacon or sausage, both cooked until crisp. Toast made from actual wheat bread, not the increasingly creative grain substitutes German bakers had resorted to. And butter for spreading. Always butter. Lunch offered sandwiches with generous portions of meat and cheese. Sometimes there was fresh fruit, apples, oranges, things that had become impossibly rare luxuries in wartime Germany. Dinner continued to feature proteins and vegetables in quantities that would have fed a German family for a week. Roasted meats, fried chicken, steaks, potatoes prepared a dozen different ways, always with butter or gravy or both. The abundance was relentless, overwhelming, undeniable. Corporal Sullivan had been watching the prisoners, carefully noting their reactions to the food with a mixture of sympathy and concern. She had been briefed on German propaganda claims about American shortages. She understood intellectually that these women had believed they were coming to a land of deprivation, but seeing their actual shock at normal American military rations gave her a new perspective on just how thoroughly they had been deceived. She mentioned her observations to Sergeant Jackson one afternoon as he prepared the evening meal. The cook paused in his work, considering her words. He had grown up poor in rural Mississippi during the Depression. He understood hunger in a way that many of his fellow soldiers did not. He had seen the way the German women ate, the speed, the desperation in their movements, the way they cleaned their plates completely and looked almost guilty about asking for seconds. It reminded him of his own childhood, of times when his family hadn't known where the next meal would come from. These women, he realized, had been living with that uncertainty for years, even before their capture, even while serving in their own military, supposedly fighting for a victorious nation that had resources to spare. The contrast was stark, damning, impossible to rationalize away. Tilly had taken to lingering near the mess hall between meals, drawn by curiosity about the source of such abundance. Through the kitchen windows, she could observe the American staff at work. What she saw continued to undermine her understanding of the war. Sacks of potatoes were stacked along one wall, dozens of them. More potatoes than she had seen in one place since before the war. Crates of canned goods lined shelves from floor to ceiling. A large refrigeration unit miraculously functioning, despite what she had been told about American infrastructure collapse, held quantities of milk butter and fresh vegetables that seemed impossible. One afternoon, Sergeant Jackson noticed her watching. After checking with Corporal Sullivan, he invited her inside to see the kitchen properly. Through halting English and Wilhelm Klein's translation, he explained the American military supply system. Food came from farms across the country, he told her, transported by a logistics network that had actually grown more efficient during the war rather than collapsing as German propaganda claimed. The abundance she saw was normal, expected, the baseline for feeding American soldiers, and by extension of the Geneva Convention prisoners in their custody. The realization of how thoroughly they had been deceived created a complex emotional storm within the German prisoners. By their second week at Camp Carson, the women were no longer simply grateful for the food they received. They were struggling with shame, confusion, and a growing anger at the system that had lied to them so completely. The cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing daily created conversations that grew increasingly heated during their free time in the barracks. Herta found herself at the center of many of these discussions. As the oldest prisoner and a medical professional, the other women looked to her for guidance in processing their conflicting emotions. She understood their turmoil because she felt it herself every time she sat down to a meal. The food was better than what she had eaten as a free woman in Germany, better than what she had been served while working in field hospitals, supposedly supporting victorious German forces. Every bite reminded her that she had been part of a massive deception. Some women like Mina initially tried to rationalize the contradiction. Perhaps this particular camp was unusual, she suggested. Perhaps the Americans were feeding them well as part of some psychological operation designed to weaken their resolve. But this explanation grew harder to maintain as days became weeks and the food never diminished in quality or quantity. The abundance wasn't a trick or a temporary display. It was simply how Americans fed people, even their enemies. Tilly wrestled with a different aspect of the shame. She had been hungry for so long that the relief of regular adequate meals felt almost sinfully good. Her body responded to the nutrition with obvious gratitude. She slept better, felt stronger, noticed her hair becoming less brittle, her skin improving. The hollows in her cheeks were filling out. Color was returning to her complexion. But with each physical improvement came a wave of guilt. Was she betraying Germany by accepting American food? Was she collaborating with the enemy by allowing her body to heal and strengthen in their custody? The shame was compounded by the kindness with which the food was offered. If the Americans had been cruel, if they had mocked the prisoners' hunger, or made them beg for meals, it would have been easier to maintain the narrative of American barbarism that had sustained German resistance. But Sergeant Jackson served food with quiet dignity, never commenting on how quickly the women ate or how thoroughly they cleaned their plates. Corporal Sullivan ensured that anyone who was still hungry could request additional portions without judgment or interrogation. The guards treated them with a professional courtesy that was somehow more devastating than cruelty would have been. One evening, Trudy tried to refuse seconds, her guilt overwhelming her hunger. She sat at the table with her clean plate visibly struggling with herself as other women returned to the serving line. Eloise, sitting across from her, finally spoke what many were thinking. "We were lied to," she said quietly in German. "Everything they told us about America was a lie. Refusing to eat won't change that. It will only mean we suffer for no reason, just as we suffered in Germany for no reason." The words hung in the air, uncomfortable but undeniable, a truth that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. By late November, as the Colorado winter began to assert itself with serious intent, the physical transformation of the prisoners had become impossible to ignore. The women who had arrived looking gaunt and unhealthy were gaining weight. Their faces were filling out. Their complexions were improving. Their energy levels were rising noticeably. The camp physician, Captain Robert Morrison, documented the changes in his monthly reports with a mixture of professional satisfaction and troubled awareness of what these improvements revealed about the prisoners' previous conditions. He conducted routine health examinations, and his findings painted a clear picture. On average, the women had gained between 10 and 15 pounds since their arrival. But more significantly, blood tests showed improvements in markers that indicated they had been suffering from vitamin deficiencies and protein malnutrition before their capture. Their bodies were responding to adequate nutrition with dramatic healing that suggested they had been operating in a state of deprivation for extended periods, possibly years. The women themselves noticed the changes with complicated feelings. Tilly found that her uniform, which had hung loosely on her frame when she arrived, now fit properly. Her hair had regained some of its natural thickness and shine. She could see in her reflection that her face had lost the hollow, angular quality that had characterized her appearance during her final months in Germany. She should have felt pleased about looking healthier, but instead she felt a persistent guilt that intensified with each physical improvement. Because while she was growing stronger, healthier, more vital, her family back in Germany was still suffering, still hungry, still struggling with shortages that showed no signs of improving. The contrast between her improving condition and their deteriorating situation became a source of profound moral distress. Trudy articulated what many were thinking during a conversation in the barracks one cold evening. "We are healthier as prisoners than we were as free women serving our own country," she said quietly. "What does that say about everything we believed? What does it say about the government we served?" The question hung in the cold air, unanswerable but demanding acknowledgement. Mina had begun keeping careful notes about the changes she observed in herself and others, a habit born from her administrative training. She documented weight gains, improvements in skin and hair quality, increased energy levels, even changes in emotional states. Many women who had been depressed and listless upon arrival were now more active and engaged. Sleep quality had improved across the board. Minor health complaints that had plagued women for months or years had resolved themselves with proper nutrition. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but the improvement in their physical condition created a new source of shame and confusion, because improvement meant acknowledging just how badly they had been suffering before, just how completely their own government had failed to provide for them while sending them to fight a war based on lies. December arrived with heavy snow that transformed Camp Carson into a landscape both beautiful and alien to the German prisoners. Most had never experienced mountain winters. The dramatic Colorado weather became another reminder of how far from home they truly were. But the approaching Christmas holiday created an atmosphere of complicated emotions throughout the compound. For many prisoners, this would be their first Christmas away from family, their first holiday celebrated in enemy captivity. And no one knew quite how to navigate the strange intersection of tradition, homesickness, and their current circumstances. Corporal Sullivan proposed organizing a modest Christmas celebration for the prisoners, understanding that depression and homesickness could pose serious morale and health problems during the holidays. She cleared the idea with Camp Command receiving permission to allow the women to create simple decorations and to organize an evening gathering on Christmas Eve. What she didn't tell the prisoners immediately was that Sergeant Jackson had been planning something special for the Christmas meal, something that would prove to be another turning point in their understanding of American intentions. The prisoners approached the holiday preparations with cautious interest. Tilly and several others volunteered to create decorations from available materials, cutting paper stars and chains from old newspapers and magazines. Herta organized a small group to practice German Christmas carols, thinking that music might help ease the homesickness that was becoming increasingly visible in the barracks. The activities provided welcome distraction from the uncertainty about their futures and the guilt many felt about being adequately fed while their families in Germany struggled. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, the Colorado sky brilliant with stars visible in the thin mountain air. The mess hall had been transformed as much as circumstances allowed. The paper decorations hung from rafters. Candles borrowed from the camp chapel provided warm light. The women gathered nervously, unsure what to expect from an American Christmas celebration. Then Sergeant Jackson and his kitchen staff began bringing out the Christmas meal, and the prisoners fell into stunned silence. The dinner exceeded anything they had experienced in their weeks at the camp. Roasted turkey, golden brown and steaming, emerged from the kitchen on large platters. Sweet potatoes topped with what appeared to be marshmallows created a dish none of the German women had ever seen before. Fresh rolls, still warm from the oven, were piled in baskets. Cranberry sauce gleamed red in serving bowls, green beans with slivered almonds, mashed potatoes with gravy, and for dessert, pumpkin pie. The abundance was overwhelming. Eloise began crying quietly before the meal even began, overwhelmed by the generosity being shown to them as prisoners on a holiday that should have been reserved for celebration among families and friends. Mina stared at the turkey as if unable to believe it was real. Even Herta, who had maintained careful emotional control since their arrival, felt her composure crack at the sight of such abundance being offered to enemy prisoners on what should have been the Americans' own special celebration. That Christmas dinner became a moment of profound transformation for many of the women, because it wasn't just food, it was a gesture of humanity that transcended nationality and politics and the artificial divisions that war created. It was Americans sharing their most important holiday meal with people who had until recently been trying to kill American soldiers. The kindness was almost unbearable, and it raised questions that would haunt them for months to come. If America could be this generous to enemies, this kind to people who had served a regime that had brought horror to the world, what did that say about American values? What did it say about the propaganda they had believed? What did it mean about the choice they would eventually have to make? If you remember celebrating Christmas during wartime, or if your families shared their table with those who had less, even in difficult times, share that memory in the comments. These traditions of generosity define who we are as Americans. They connect us across generations. The kindness shown that Christmas Eve would prove to be a turning point. But the real test was still ahead. The Christmas celebration marked a subtle but significant shift in the relationship between prisoners and their American captors. In the days following the holiday, conversations became more frequent and more personal. The barrier of mutual suspicion that had characterized the first weeks of captivity had been weakened by the generosity shown during what should have been the Americans' own special celebration. Women who had previously kept their distance from the guards began initiating conversations, asking questions, attempting to understand the people who had shown them such unexpected kindness. The improvement in communication was helped by the fact that several of the prisoners were rapidly acquiring English. Tilly, who had studied a bit of English in school before the war, found the language coming back to her with surprising ease. She practiced with Wilhelm Klein during his off hours. He was patient, encouraging, willing to explain idioms and pronunciation. He seemed to genuinely enjoy teaching, seemed to take pleasure in watching her progress. Corporal Sullivan found herself becoming an informal confidant to several of the prisoners, particularly those whose English was improving. She was young enough to relate to them as peers, old enough to have the authority her rank required, and she was genuinely curious about their experiences, their thoughts, their transformation. 2 weeks after Christmas, in the first days of 1945, she was making her rounds through the compound when she encountered Herta sitting alone in the common room, staring at a letter she had received from Germany. The older woman's face showed signs of recent tears. Her hands trembled slightly as they held the thin paper. Sullivan hesitated before approaching, unsure whether her presence would be welcome or intrusive in what appeared to be a private moment of grief. Herta looked up. After a moment's hesitation, she gestured for Sullivan to join her. The two women sat in silence for a few moments. Then Herta began to speak in careful, accented English. She had been practicing too. "My sister writes from Nuremberg," she said quietly. "She tells me they have no butter since 1942. No real butter for 3 years." She paused, struggling with both the language and the emotion. "She tells me their Christmas dinner was turnip soup and a small piece of bread. This was all they had for Christmas." Sullivan listened without interrupting as Herta continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "I have not told her what we eat here. How can I tell her? She will think I am lying or that I have become mad. Or worse, she will think I am collaborating with the enemy because I am grateful for food that should not exist if everything we were told about America was true." Herta's hands twisted the letter, creasing the thin paper. "I was a nurse, Corporal Sullivan. I saw wounded soldiers with no morphine for their pain because we had none. I saw men die from infections because we had no antibiotics. And I believed this was necessary sacrifice for victory." The confession seemed to exhaust something in Herta. She looked at Sullivan with an expression that combined shame, anger, and desperate confusion. "Why do you feed us so well?" she asked. "We are your enemies. We serve the country that started this war. Why do you give us butter when my sister has none? Why do your prisoners eat better than my family?" Sullivan considered her response carefully, understanding that this moment required honesty rather than diplomatic platitudes. "Because feeding people properly is the right thing to do, regardless of who they are or what country they come from," she said finally. "And because we have enough to share. America isn't perfect, but we do have enough food. We always have." Herta absorbed this quietly, then asked the question that had been haunting her since her arrival. "Everything they told us about America was a lie, wasn't it? Everything about your country, collapsing, about your people, starving, about your soldiers having nothing. It was all lies." Sullivan nodded. "Yes, it was all lies." Herta closed her eyes briefly as if absorbing a physical blow, then opened them with an expression of grim determination. "Then what else was a lie? What else did they tell us that wasn't true?" The question hung between them. Heavy with implications, neither woman was quite ready to fully explore. By late November, the prisoners had been permitted to write letters home, subject to military censorship. The announcement brought a mixture of relief and anxiety to the barracks. Most of the women had not been in contact with their families since their capture, some for even longer. The prospect of finally communicating with loved ones in Germany should have been joyful. But instead, it created a new dilemma that kept many women awake at night, wrestling with impossible choices about truth and silence. Tilly sat at a wooden table in the common room with a single sheet of paper before her, a pencil in her hand, and absolutely no idea what to write. How could she tell her mother and sister in Stuttgart about her life in captivity without mentioning the food? But if she did mention the food, how could she possibly make them understand without sounding insane or seeming to have been brainwashed by American propaganda? The abundance she experienced daily at Camp Carson was so far beyond anything available in Germany that describing it accurately would make her letters sound like fantasy. She started several times, each attempt ending with the paper crumpled and discarded. "Dear Mother," she wrote, "I am safe and well treated. We receive adequate food." But adequate was a lie, a massive understatement that felt like a betrayal of the truth she had discovered. "Dear Mother, I am safe. The Americans feed us butter and fresh meat daily." But that sounded like mockery when she knew her family was surviving on rations that had been cut repeatedly, when her mother was giving her own food to her grandchildren, when hunger was a daily grinding reality that defined their existence. There was no way to describe her reality without either lying or causing pain to people she loved, who were suffering while she, a prisoner, ate better than she had in years. Around the room, other women grappled with the same impossible task. Some chose to write brief, emotionless notes that revealed almost nothing about their daily lives. "I am alive. I am unharmed. I hope to see you again soon." Others wrote longer letters that carefully avoided any mention of food or living conditions, focusing instead on questions about family members and requests for news from home. A few, like Mina, wrote detailed letters describing everything they were experiencing, knowing the military censors would likely remove most of the content before the letters were sent. Tilly finally settled on a compromise. She wrote a letter that was honest but vague, describing adequate treatment without specifics. But separately in her leather diary, she began documenting everything in detail. She wrote about the butter, the fresh milk, the quantities of meat and vegetables. She described Sergeant Jackson's kitchen and Corporal Sullivan's kindness. She documented her own shame and confusion. Someday, she told herself, this record might matter. Someday someone might need to know the truth about what they had experienced, about the lies they had believed and the reality they had discovered. The women wrote their letters in late November. They sent them off not knowing when or if replies would come. 3 months passed. Winter deepened into the harshest cold the women had ever experienced. The Colorado mountains were buried under snow. The camp became an isolated world, cut off and self-contained. Life fell into a rhythm of meals and work assignments and evening conversations in the barracks. The women's English improved. Their health continued to strengthen. And always underneath everything, the questions festered. What did it mean that they were thriving in captivity while their families suffered in freedom? Then in late February, the mail call brought a particularly large delivery of letters from Germany. The atmosphere in the barracks that evening was heavy with grief and guilt. The letters painted a picture of a country in collapse, of cities reduced to rubble, of families scattered or destroyed, and most persistently of hunger that had become the defining reality of civilian life in Germany. The women read their letters in silence, each absorbing news that made their own circumstances feel increasingly surreal and wrong. Tilly received a letter from her sister that she read 3 times, trying to comprehend words that seemed impossible. Her sister described how their mother had given her own food portions to the children, how she had grown weak and thin from sacrificing her meals. The family's ration cards provided barely enough to survive, and even those meager allotments were often unavailable because supply chains had broken down completely. Her sister wrote about neighbors who had died from starvation-related illnesses, about children with swollen bellies and blank eyes, about the desperate search for anything edible that had become the central focus of daily life. And then near the end of the letter, a single line that made Tilly's hands shake as she held the paper. "Grandmother died in December. The doctor said her heart gave out, but we know it was hunger. She was giving her food to the children too." Across the barracks, similar scenes were unfolding as women absorbed news from their families. Mina learned that her brother had been killed in the final months of fighting and that her elderly parents were living in a bombed-out building with no heat and almost no food. Trudy learned that her family in Munich had been reduced to eating soup made from grass and whatever they could scavenge from the ruins. Eloise discovered that her younger sister had died from pneumonia complicated by malnutrition, her body too weak to fight off illness. The contrast between their family's suffering and their own relative comfort became unbearable. That evening, several women refused dinner entirely unable to face eating when they knew their loved ones were starving. Others ate mechanically each bite, accompanied by waves of guilt that made the food taste like ash. Herta watched her fellow prisoners struggle with this impossible moral equation and understood that they were facing at a crisis that went beyond simple hunger or survival. This was about identity, about loyalty, about what it meant to accept help from people you had been taught to hate while people you loved suffered. Corporal Sullivan noticed the change immediately. The mess hall, usually filled with quiet conversation during meals, had become silent, except for the sounds of reluctant eating. Women who had been gaining weight and health now pushed food around their plates, their expressions haunted. Some were crying openly. The letters had stripped away any remaining psychological distance between their experience as prisoners and the reality their families faced in Germany. That night, Tilly wrote in her diary with shaking hands, "I ate roasted chicken and mashed potatoes with butter, while my mother starves herself to feed her grandchildren. Grandmother is dead from hunger, while I grow fat and healthy in captivity. I sleep in a warm bed while my family huddles in ruins without heat. I am a prisoner who lives better than free Germans. How can this be right? How can this be justice?" She paused, then added words that captured what many prisoners were feeling. "We were told America was our enemy, but America feeds us while Germany starves its own people. Who then is the real enemy? And what does that make us for having served them?" The crisis triggered by the letters from Germany led to intense debates among the prisoners about their moral obligations and the meaning of their situation. In the evenings, groups gathered in the barracks to discuss questions that had no easy answers. Should they refuse to eat in solidarity with their starving families? Should they be grateful for adequate food or ashamed of having it while Germans suffered? Did accepting American generosity constitute betrayal of their country, or was it simply survival? Tilly found herself at the center of many of these discussions. Her intelligence and thoughtfulness made her a natural voice in the debates. She argued that refusing to eat accomplished nothing except making themselves suffer pointlessly. Their hunger in Colorado would not feed families in Germany. Their declining health would not improve conditions in Stuttgart or Munich or Berlin. Martyrdom through self-starvation was emotional theater that served no practical purpose and helped no one. But Eloise disagreed vehemently. "How can we sit here eating butter and meat while our families starve?" she demanded during one heated evening discussion. "Every bite feels like betrayal. Every meal reminds me that I am alive and comfortable while my sister is dead from hunger. If we accept this food without protest, without some gesture of solidarity, are we not saying that American comfort matters more than German suffering?" Herta listened to both sides before offering her own perspective as a nurse who had seen the consequences of malnutrition up close. "I understand wanting to refuse food as a gesture of solidarity," she said carefully, "but I have watched people die from starvation and its complications. It is a terrible death, slow and painful. Choosing that death when you have access to food does not honor those who had no choice. It wastes the life you still have." The debate continued for hours with different women articulating different positions based on their own experiences and values. Some argued that they should eat and maintain their health precisely because they might eventually return to Germany, where they could help with reconstruction. Others felt that accepting American generosity while Germans starved was a form of collaboration that stained their honor. A few suggested that their situation was so morally complicated that there were no clear right answers, only choices that each woman had to make for herself. Mina proposed a different approach entirely. Instead of refusing to eat or accepting food with guilt, she suggested they should bear witness to what they were experiencing. They should document the truth about American abundance and German lies. They should preserve evidence that might someday help other Germans understand how thoroughly they had been deceived. Suffering through unnecessary hunger would not accomplish this, but surviving to tell the truth might. Tilly found this argument compelling. "So we were lied to about everything," she said. The least we can do is preserve the truth for those who come after us. If we die from refusing food, we take that truth with us. If we survive, we can testify to what we learn. The discussion ended without full consensus. But most women agreed that purposeful starvation served no one's interests. They would eat, they would live, and they would remember. Now, if you've ever questioned what you were told by those in power, if you've ever had a moment where everything you believed was challenged by simple, undeniable truth, you understand what these women felt. Share your story in the comments below. These moments of awakening matter. They connect us across generations. A few days after the intense debates in the barracks, Tilly approached Sergeant Jackson during kitchen cleanup. She hoped to understand the perspective of the man whose generosity had become the focal point of so much prisoner guilt and confusion. Through a mixture of her improving English and Wilhelm Klein's translation assistance, she asked him directly why he fed them so well when their own families in Germany were starving. Did he not feel that they deserved to suffer as their families suffered? Sergeant Jackson paused in his work, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. He gestured for Tilly to sit at one of the mess hall tables. He joined her, his large hands folded on the scarred wooden surface. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of personal experience that gave his words authority beyond his rank. I grew up poor, he began, real poor. Not just wartime shortages, but depression, poverty, where we didn't know if we'd eat from one day to the next. He described his childhood in rural Mississippi, the constant hunger that had been his companion through his early years, the shame that came with being the kid whose stomach growled in school, whose clothes were too thin for winter, whose family was known throughout the county as people who had nothing. His mother, he explained, had performed miracles of creativity to feed 7 children on almost nothing. She had foraged for wild greens, trapped small animals, traded labor for food, somehow kept her children alive through years when many families lost members to starvation and disease. And through all of that, he said, she taught us that hungry people deserve to eat regardless of who they were or why they were hungry. Hunger isn't something people earn or deserve. It's just suffering. And easing suffering when you can is what decent people do. He looked at Tilly directly, his dark eyes serious. You ask me if you deserve to suffer because your families are suffering back in Germany. I say suffering isn't something anyone deserves. And adding your suffering to theirs doesn't reduce the total amount of suffering in the world. It just means more people are hurting. He paused. I can't feed your families in Germany. I wish I could, but I can't. What I can do is feed you right here, right now. And that's what I'm going to keep doing. Tilly felt tears welling up, moved by the simple moral clarity of his position. But we are your enemies, she said quietly. We served Germany. We were part of the war against America. Jackson shrugged. You're people who need food, and I have food to give. That's all that matters in my kitchen. Whatever happened before you got here, whatever you did or didn't do in the war, none of that changes the fact that you're hungry and I can feed you. His philosophy was simple but profound, and it cut through all the complicated moral debates that had consumed the prisoners for days. In that moment, Tilly understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. American kindness wasn't weakness. It wasn't naivety. It was strength. The kind of strength that could afford to be generous because it came from values that didn't change based on who was receiving kindness. And that understanding would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Because in just 3 months on a spring morning that should have brought joy to the entire world, Tilly and 21 other women would make a choice that would shock everyone who witnessed it. The winter months passed slowly at Camp Carson. March brought the first hints of spring to the Colorado mountains. Snow began to melt. The air lost some of its brutal edge, and with the changing season came news from Europe that made it clear the war was entering its final phase. By April, even the most optimistic German supporters understood that defeat was inevitable. The radio reports that filtered through the camp described Allied forces closing in from all sides. Berlin was under siege. The Nazi leadership was in chaos. It was only a matter of time. The women at Camp Carson listened to these reports with complicated emotions. Part of them wanted Germany to fight on to somehow achieve the impossible victory they had once believed was certain. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger with each meal, with each act of American kindness, wondered if surrender might not be a mercy, an end to the suffering. a chance to rebuild something better from the ruins. On the morning of May 8, 1945, Colonel Patterson called a General Assembly. All prisoners were to report to the mess hall at 1000 hours. No exceptions. The women gathered with nervous anticipation. They knew something significant was happening. You could feel it in the air, in the way the guards moved, in the unusual solemnity of the American personnel. Colonel Patterson stood at the front of the hall, his expression grave but not unkind. Wilhelm Klein stood beside him, ready to translate. Ladies, the colonel began, I have news from Europe. The room went absolutely silent. At 0241 hours this morning, German High Command signed an unconditional surrender to Allied forces. The war in Europe is over. Germany has been defeated. The words hung in the air. Some of the women began to cry. Others sat in stunned silence. A few nodded as if confirming something they had already known in their hearts. Tilly felt numb. She had known this was coming. They all had. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that mere anticipation never could. The colonel continued, under the terms of surrender and in accordance with the Geneva Convention arrangements will be made for your repatriation to Germany. Transportation will be organized within the next 3 to 4 weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes or to whatever remains of them in occupied Germany. He paused, his eyes moving across the assembled women. I want you to know that during your time here, you have conducted yourselves with dignity. You have worked hard. You have caused no trouble. The staff here has spoken highly of your cooperation. Whatever happened before you came here, whatever uniform you once wore, you have earned our respect. The International Red Cross will assist in locating family members for those who have lost contact. Medical examinations will be conducted before departure. You will be provided with appropriate clothing and basic supplies for the journey. Are there any questions? Silence. Then Tilly stood up. Her legs were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke in careful English. Colonel Patterson, may I speak for some of us? The colonel looked surprised but gestured for her to continue. Tilly looked around at her fellow prisoners. She caught Herta's eye. The older woman nodded encouragingly. Eloise was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Mina's face was pale but determined. Some of us have been discussing our situation, Tilly said, her accent thick, but her words clear. We wish to ask if there might be alternatives to immediate repatriation. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. The colonel held up his hand for silence. I'm not sure I understand, he said carefully. You wish to delay your return? Tilly took a deep breath. Not delay, sir. Some of us wish to ask if there might be a way to remain. Here, in America. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and confusion. Colonel Patterson stared at her. The American guards exchanged bewildered glances. Several of the German women who had been planning to return home looked at Tilly as if she had lost her mind. Slowly, one by one, other women stood up. Herta rose to her full height, her nurse's posture straight and proud. Then Eloise, tears streaming down her face. Then Mina. Then Trudy. More women standing until 22 prisoners were on their feet facing their American captor with an impossible request. The colonel found his voice. Miss Bauer, I need to understand what you're asking. You want to stay in America. As prisoners, Herta stepped forward, adding her voice to Tilly's. Colonel, we understand this is unusual. We know the laws require repatriation, but we have reasons for this request. Many of us have no families to return to. Some have lost everyone in the bombing. Others have not heard from their families in years and don't know if anyone is alive. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But it's more than that, sir. We have learned things here that have changed how we understand the world. We were lied to about America, about the war, about everything. Going back to Germany means returning to a country that no longer reflects what we thought we were serving. It means returning to starvation after months of adequate food. It means facing suspicion and shame for having been captured and supposedly corrupted by enemy influence. Tilly spoke again, her voice stronger now. Here we have found something we never expected. Dignity even as enemies. Kindness where we anticipated cruelty. The chance to work and contribute and become better people than we were trained to be. Colonel Patterson sat down heavily. He looked at Wilhelm Klein, who nodded, confirming that the translation was accurate. Ladies, the colonel said slowly, I need to consult with higher command about this. What you're asking is unprecedented. I don't know if it's even legally possible. He looked at the 22 women standing before him. But I will forward your request. I will explain your circumstances. And I will recommend that your petition be given serious consideration. He stood up again. Those of you who wish to return to Germany as originally planned, your repatriation will proceed as scheduled. For those of you making this request, you will remain here while we await a decision from the War Department. The meeting ended in a chaos of emotion. The women who had chosen to stay gathered together, supporting each other, trying to process what they had just done. The women who had chosen to return looked at them with mixtures of pity, confusion, and sometimes anger. That night in the barracks, the atmosphere was tense. The 31 women who had returned to Germany kept to themselves, preparing for a journey they now faced with mixed feelings. The 22 who had asked to stay huddled together, wondering if they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Tilly couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, thinking about her mother and sister in Stuttgart. Would they understand? Would they think she had betrayed them, betrayed Germany? But then she remembered the butter melting into mashed potatoes. She remembered Sergeant Jackson's kindness, Corporal Sullivan's patience, the Christmas turkey, the simple, overwhelming truth that America had shown her about abundance and generosity and human decency. She reached for her diary in the darkness. By the dim light from the window, she wrote, "Today we asked to stay in the country that was supposed to be our enemy. I don't know if they will let us. I don't know if we made the right choice. But I know this: I would rather face an uncertain future based on truth than return to a certain future based on lies." The wait was agonizing. 10 days. 10 days of uncertainty while the War Department deliberated. 10 days of awkward meals where women who had been comrades now sat at separate tables. 10 days of wondering and hoping and fearing. The American staff treated them with extraordinary care during this period. Sergeant Jackson made sure the food remained excellent. Corporal Sullivan checked in on the 22, regularly offering reassurance without making promises she couldn't keep. Wilhelm Klein helped Tilly and several others draft proper written statements explaining their request. They needed to articulate their reasons clearly, formally, for the bureaucrats who would decide their fate. On the 11th day, Colonel Patterson called another assembly. The 22 women filed in, their faces showing the strain of waiting. The colonel held a telegram. His expression was carefully neutral. "Ladies, the War Department has made their decision." The room held its breath. "They will not prevent the immediate repatriation of any prisoner who wishes to return to Germany. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wish to remain may be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war." Hope flickered in Tilly's chest. This classification will allow you to apply for sponsors and potentially for immigration status. However, it also means you will no longer be guaranteed housing and support at this military facility. You will need to find civilian sponsors, employment, housing. You will need to build lives as displaced persons in America. He looked at each of them in turn. This will not be easy. Many communities will not welcome former enemy nationals. You will face suspicion, hostility, and discrimination. You will need to work hard to prove yourselves worthy of the chance you're being given. But if you choose to accept these terms, America will give you that chance. Tilly felt tears running down her face. Herta was openly weeping. Eloise was shaking with relief. Of the 22 who had originally stood up, 9 ultimately chose to accept the challenge of building new lives in America. 13 decided the uncertainty was too great and opted for repatriation despite knowing the hardships they would face in Germany. The 31 women who had never wavered in their desire to return home prepared for departure with dignity. Several came to the 9 who were staying to say goodbye. There were no hard feelings, not really, just different choices made by people trying to navigate an impossible situation. On June 20th, the departures began. The 31 women who had chosen to return to Germany stood in formation one last time, but their military bearing had softened over the months. They carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff. More importantly, they carried a different understanding of what America represented, a truth that contradicted years of propaganda and that they were determined to share with other Germans. Herta, who had ultimately chosen to stay, embraced several of the departing women. "You will tell them the truth," she said in German. "You will tell them what we learned here." One of the departing women nodded. "We will. They need to know." Germany needs to know. The trucks rolled out of Camp Carson carrying women who would return to a defeated, devastated nation. But they would return as carriers of a kind of reconciliation. They had experienced American values firsthand. They knew what was possible when former enemies treated each other with dignity. For the 9 who stayed, the real work was just beginning. Finding sponsors proved easier than anyone had expected. Local families and organizations moved by the women's story and their obvious sincerity stepped forward to offer support. A rancher family outside Colorado Springs offered to sponsor Tilly, providing housing while she sought employment as a translator. Her English was now fluent enough for professional work. The local hospital arranged for Herta to continue her medical training under supervision, with plans to help her obtain American nursing certification. Other sponsors emerged from church groups and community organizations that saw the women's integration as an opportunity to demonstrate American values of second chances and redemption. The 9 women scattered across Colorado and neighboring states, each beginning the long, difficult process of building new lives from nothing. But they carried with them the lessons learned in those months at Camp Carson. Lessons about kindness and truth and the power of simple decency to transform hearts. 25 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon in 1970, Ottilie Bauer Henderson stood in a university lecture hall in Denver, Colorado. She was 46 years old now, an American citizen, mother of 3 children who had never known hunger, grandmother to 2 babies who would grow up in prosperity their Oma could never have imagined in her youth. Her career as a translator for the State Department had been successful, respected. She had worked on diplomatic missions, helped rebuild relationships between America and Germany, served as a bridge between the country of her birth and the country of her choice. But today she was here for a different purpose. The University of Denver had invited her to speak about her experiences as a German prisoner of war and her subsequent life as an American immigrant. It was part of a lecture series on World War II, on reconciliation, on the paths that led from enmity to friendship. The lecture hall was full. Students, faculty, veterans, some people from the community who had heard about the talk and wanted to attend. Tilly, as she was still known to her friends, stood at the podium with that same small leather diary she had clutched when she first arrived at Camp Carson 26 years earlier. She began by describing that first meal in the mess hall, the moment when she had seen real butter melting into mashed potatoes and had felt the foundations of her worldview begin to crack. The butter was just butter, she told the audience, but it represented something far larger. It was proof that everything we had been told about American deprivation was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else had we been lied to about? That single pat of butter started a process of questioning that eventually led me to understand that I had been serving a government built on deception. She spoke about the transformation that adequate food had brought, not just physically, but psychologically and morally. When you are hungry, truly hungry over extended time, it narrows your world, she explained. You cannot think clearly about politics or morality or justice when your body is consuming itself. The Americans didn't just feed us. They gave us back the mental clarity to recognize that we had been deceived. They created the conditions in which we could acknowledge uncomfortable truths about our own country. She talked about the letters from Germany, about learning that her grandmother had died from hunger, while she, a prisoner, had grown healthy and strong. That was the hardest part, she said quietly. Not the capture, not the imprisonment. The hardest part was eating butter while my grandmother starved. Learning that I was healthier as a prisoner in America than my family was as free Germans. She described the debates in the barracks about whether to eat, about guilt and loyalty and the meaning of survival. We had to decide who we wanted to be. Were we going to let guilt destroy us? Or were we going to accept the gift we had been given and use it to become better people? She spoke about Sergeant Jackson's philosophy of feeding people, because hunger was suffering, not because they deserved kindness. He taught me something profound about American values, Tilly said. It's not about whether someone deserves help. It's about having the abundance and the moral confidence to help anyway. That's real strength. That's what made me want to become an American. She talked about the impossible choice on May 8, 1945, about standing up in front of the colonel and asking to stay. We asked to remain prisoners rather than accept freedom because we had discovered that freedom without truth is just another kind of prison. We had been free in Germany, but we had been enslaved by lies. In America, even as prisoners, we had been set free by truth. She held up the small leather diary. Its pages were yellowed with age, but its contents were preserved. In these pages, I documented everything. The butter, the fresh milk, the kindness of Sergeant Jackson and Corporal Sullivan, my confusion, my shame, my gradual understanding that enemies could become friends. She opened the diary to a page marked with a faded ribbon, read aloud in a voice that still carried traces of her German accent even after 25 years of speaking English. November 14th, 1944. Today, I tasted real butter for the first time in 3 years. It was on mashed potatoes served by an American cook in a prison camp in Colorado. And as it melted in my mouth, I realized something terrifying. Everything we were told was a lie. She looked up at the young faces before her, students who had been born after the war, who had grown up in prosperity, who couldn't imagine the hunger and deprivation that had defined her youth. The remarkable thing about America, she said slowly, is not that it is perfect, because it isn't. No country is. The remarkable thing is that it gave me the freedom to discover truth, to change my mind, to become someone different than who I was trained to be. She paused, letting the words sink in. That freedom began with butter and mashed potatoes, with the simple act of feeding hungry people adequately regardless of who they were or what they had done. Tilly glanced at the back of the room. Sitting there, distinguished by age but still recognizable, was Corporal Sullivan. Now Francine Sullivan Thompson, retired. She had come to hear Tilly speak. Beside her sat a tall black man with silver hair. Sergeant Jackson, also retired, who had traveled from Mississippi to be here. Tilly smiled at them. They smiled back. 25 years of friendship built on a foundation of butter and kindness. She turned back to the audience. I want to end with this. Some of you will leave this room and forget what I've said. Some will remember it as an interesting historical anecdote. But I hope a few of you will understand the deeper truth. What happened to me at Camp Carson wasn't just about food. It was about the power of simple decency to overcome hatred, the power of truth to destroy propaganda, the power of kindness to transform enemies into friends. Those American soldiers didn't have to treat us well. They could have been cruel. They could have been merely correct according to the Geneva Convention. But they chose kindness. They chose generosity. They chose to see us as people rather than as enemies. And that choice changed my life, changed the lives of every woman in that camp, whether she stayed in America or returned to Germany. Because we all learned that the values we had been taught to hate, the American values of individual dignity and human decency, were real. They weren't propaganda. They weren't lies. They were lived truths. She closed the diary gently. That's what I want you to remember. That's what I want you to carry forward. In a world that often chooses cruelty, choose kindness. In a world that often embraces lies, choose truth. In a world that often breeds hatred, choose understanding. Because a single act of decency, something as simple as adding butter to a plate of mashed potatoes, can change the world. The audience erupted in applause. Tilly stood at the podium, tears streaming down her face, thinking about her grandmother, who had died from hunger, about her mother who had survived the war and had eventually forgiven her daughter for staying in America, about the children she had raised to be proud Americans who also understood their German heritage. After the lecture, she met with Corporal Sullivan and Sergeant Jackson. They embraced like the old friends they had become. You changed our lives too, Francine said. You and the others. You reminded us why we were fighting, not just to defeat an enemy, but to defend values worth preserving. Sergeant Jackson nodded. Your grandmother would be proud, Tilly. Not because you became an American, but because you survived, because you told the truth, because you made something good come from all that suffering. Tilly wiped her eyes. She would be 84 years old before she died in 2008, having lived long enough to see Germany and America as close allies, long enough to see the European Union, long enough to see her grandchildren and great-grandchildren grow up in a world where the hatreds that had defined her youth seemed like ancient history. But she never forgot the butter, never forgot that first meal that had opened her eyes to truth, never forgot the simple kindness that had transformed an enemy into a friend. In her final years, she would often tell the story to anyone who would listen, to her great-grandchildren who found it hard to believe that Oma had once been considered an enemy of America, to students who interviewed her for school projects, to historians documenting the experiences of German prisoners of war. And she always ended the story the same way. Remember this, she would say, hatred is taught, propaganda is constructed, enmity is created by those who benefit from division. But kindness is a choice. Truth is powerful. And sometimes the most revolutionary, act is simply feeding people well and treating them with dignity. That's what America taught me. That's what I've tried to live ever since. And that's what I hope you'll carry forward into whatever future you build. Because the world needs more butter and mashed potatoes, more generosity, more truth, more kindness that transcends borders and politics and all the artificial divisions that keep us apart. The world needs more people willing to choose decency even toward their enemies, especially toward their enemies. That's how you change the world. One pat of butter at a time. Now I want to hear from you. What traditional American values do you think are most important to preserve today? What acts of kindness have you witnessed that transcended division? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep this conversation going. Because these stories, these values, they matter. They connect us to the greatest generation. They remind us of who we can be at our best. And they show us that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a weapon at all. It's a simple act of human decency. A meal shared, a kindness given, a truth revealed. That's the America Tilly discovered in 1944. That's the America we need to remember today. That's the story of how butter changed history.